Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're thinking this afternoon about the statement that it makes sense to believe that God exists. Making sense can be a subjective thing. What makes sense to one person might not make sense to another. So I'm speaking this afternoon as someone who believes that God exists, and I'm explaining why believing that God exists makes sense to me. And I have to begin that explanation with the Bible, a book which has changed my life and has changed the life of countless others. The Bible makes daring claims about itself, that it is the Word of God, that, as we read, it can save people from death by saving knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ and faith in Him. And so it claims what no other book claims. It has a great unity in diversity. No other book has been written in quite the same way. Yet, despite its unparalleled diversity and its unique history of formation, it has an amazing consistency, coherence, and singleness of purpose. I wonder if anyone has seen this image before. This is a visual representation of the 63,000 cross-references in the Bible. And it was a collaboration between a Lutheran pastor, Christoph Romhild, and a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And what it's showing is that each bar on the graph, if you can see my mouse moving, each bar on this graph at the bottom represents a chapter of the Bible, and the bar length corresponds to the number of verses in the passage. And then these rainbow-like arcs that go from one chapter to another represent references from a chapter in one book to a chapter in another. And as you look at the complexity and the number of these links, I'm just zooming in there, so I've just zoomed in on a small portion of it. You can see that it's astonishing. And some have commented that the Bible was the first hyperlinked text, that every part of the Bible is linked together to other parts. And there are many of us in this room and on this Zoom call who spend their lives delving into it, finding links and allusions which convince us more and more that this book is from God. And if you come to any Bible class in this hall on a Tuesday or on Zoom, you will see the reality of that. So it has an amazing unity in great diversity. There are many independent witnesses to the text of the Bible, to the text of the Old Testament, and these all witness to the same text. There are variations, and what we're talking about here are manuscripts of the Bible written in the original language. So Old Testament, mostly Hebrew, some Aramaic, and New Testament Greek. And these manuscripts bear testimony to the text that we have received. That is God's word. The majority of variants, where there are variant manuscripts, are very minor. And even the most major variants make no difference to belief. In the New Testament, there are about 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts and thousands of versions, and that easily makes the New Testament the best attested book from the ancient world. And the earliest full witness is from 200 AD, and many manuscripts from the 4th century onwards, thousands of citations. And so out of 15,000 lines in the New Testament, fewer than 100 have any sort of doubt about the variation of what the text should read. And 2/3 of that variation is very minor. So I know I've just brushed over a subject there that I've actually spoken about for 45 minutes in this hall before on, but that tells me that this is the hand of God in preserving the text of the Bible down the centuries. There are so many fulfilled Bible prophecies in the Bible. It's not the subject for this afternoon, but Bible students throughout the ages have been astonished by the accuracy with which prophecies have been fulfilled, such as the predicted continued existence of the nation of Israel, her scattering and eventual regathering to the land of promise, such as the succession of world empires predicted in the book of Daniel, from the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian to the Greek to the Roman to the divided kingdoms that we have today, such as the utter destruction of Babylon, so much so that just over 100 years ago, people doubted whether Babylon ever existed because it hadn't been found archaeologically. And yet the Bible said it existed and that it would be destroyed and not rebuilt, to name but a few. So there are fulfilled Bible prophecies we can look at objectively. And I do believe that the Bible has an explanatory power. The Bible provides a logical and credible explanation of why the world is the way it is, of why human nature is the way it is, and of what has gone wrong. And it's an explanation which many feel is the most compelling way of understanding ourselves and our world. And for me, it is a satisfying explanation. The Bible explains the emptiness and lack of purpose or direction that men and women often feel in today's world. And it tells us what we need to do in order to put things right and get back into a good relationship with God. And every reader of the Bible has to decide whether there's another book or another theory out there which fits the facts so well and come up with an alternative. So there are many things then about the Bible which say to me that the existence of God, based on the fact that the Bible claims to be from God, makes sense. Its daring claims, its unity, despite unparalleled diversity, its accuracy of preservation, the way it has survived down the centuries and millennia, the fulfilled prophecies that we can objectively look at, and the way it explains the world that we find and ourselves in it. So there is something I would like to begin with there in terms of this subject of making sense that God exists. And although I would like to keep talking at length about the Bible, that those features, given that it claims to be the book from God, are helpful in the question of the existence of God, I think if we are talking about whether it makes sense that God exists, we have to also make other arguments, other reasoning, which don't appeal to an authority, which don't cite revelation as the basis for their reasons. So where to begin with that? Well, two things to say on that. First of all, as we said before, making sense is a subjective thing. So I'm speaking as someone who believes that God exists, and I'm explaining why that belief makes sense to me. So the arguments I share make sense to me. You might say, well, they don't make sense to me in the same way, and that would be the case. So of course, we're speaking subjectively. And second of all, I'm speaking now about some topics in which I'm not an expert. The only subject I can speak to as anything like an expert at all is ophthalmology, and even then only a very small subsection of ophthalmology relating to eye movements and neuro-ophthalmology. Outside of those subjects, I don't have any expertise per se. So please give me some license to speak a little bit on subjects about which I don't know as much. But whilst we're there, ophthalmology provides the ground for a restating of our first point about that what makes sense to one person might not make sense to another person. So we look at the eye. So I'm going to just share a few images with you here, and this is where I have to be really disciplined and not speak for 20 minutes on this one little thing. But what you're seeing here is an OCT. It's an infrared scan of the back of the eye, and what's been scanned is, here's the eye. I hope that is fairly recognizable to us, that you have the cornea at the front and a lens, and at the back retina, which is the nervous tissue. The light comes through all these media and it hits the retina, and this little yellow film at the back is expanded here into these layers. These are the layers of the retina, and you can actually visualize those with a scan. So if you've been to an eye department and have had an OCT scan, then these layers, which are depicted in a drawing here, can actually be visualized in real terms by infrared scanning. So here are all those cells. They're actually arranged vertically. Now what happens in the human eye is that the light comes in and hits the retina. So here is the light coming through. I hope you can see my mouse moving, otherwise what I'm saying doesn't relate. But the light moves through all these layers and it hits the wall at the back, and it bounces back off that into these rods and cones. These are the photoreceptors. These are the cells that can detect light and convert them into an electrical signal as it moves up this way, until eventually they get into the wires, the axons of the ganglion cells that all come together. There's over 1 million of them in each of your eyes, these wires, and they all become the optic nerve, basically, that takes the vision back to the brain. And then by sheer miracle, we perceive that light as vision. And all of these layers, there's blood in them. So for example, there's a hemorrhage here where there's been a bleed, and here. So there are blood vessels in there too. What I'm pointing out here is that some might think that this is arranged backwards, because the photoreceptors don't point towards the light that's coming in, they point away from it at the wall at the back. The light has to come through all the layers and the blood, hit the wall, bounce back, and the photoreceptors see it. So you might say this is a backwards arrangement. Why wouldn't you have the photoreceptors pointing towards the light? It's like having a television and all the cables are coming out of the screen. You know, here's all the wires coming out, and the light has to come through the cables for you to see the TV screen. It's backwards. And an eye doesn't have to be arranged like that. It can be arranged in the way some people would consider to be the right way, where the photoreceptors point towards the light that's coming in. The wires come out of the back of the television and they form the optic nerve. So there's a cephalopod eye, and here's the vertebrate eye. So it could be arranged either way. And what some people would say is the fact that it's pointing the wrong way just shows us that it wasn't designed, that it just happened that way. So it could be either way. Why is it seemingly the wrong way in humans? Well, the more you learn about this, the more you find out. You discover that this way, the vertebrate way, with this arrangement, there are benefits. Because behind the wall at the back here is the choroid, which is the rich supply of blood. And if you have the photoreceptors really close to the choroid, then what you've got is the most metabolically active part of the eye, the photoreceptors, being close to the blood supply, which is what they need. The oxygen and the nutrients can be supplied directly from the choroid. And also, what is the big difference between a cephalopod eye and a human eye? The difference in the light coming into these eyes is that the cephalopod eyes don't have ultraviolet radiation coming in with the light, whereas vertebrates do. And it just so happens that this arrangement means that when the light from the sun enters our eyes, the ultraviolet radiation is filtered out as the light passes through the wires, as it were, and through the blood vessels, so that when it gets to the photoreceptors, the ultraviolet has been mostly removed. So the eye is protected. If the human eye was inverted, like the cephalopod eye, then probably we'd go blind within a few years from ultraviolet exposure. So there it is. There is the arrangement of the human eye. I look at the eye and I see design, I see wonder, I see the hand of God. My colleague looks at the eye and sees poor design and evidence that there is no designer. I find it highly improbable that with no forethought, no intelligence, no thought whatsoever of the end result, that random mutation could have resulted over time in something as staggeringly complex as the eye. But that is my subjective feeling on it. But these things and others are why it makes sense to me to believe that God exists. So there you have something where two equally intelligent people can look at exactly the same thing, understand it the same, but come to entirely different philosophical conclusions about what they understood. So that point there emphasizes why it is subjective, and we have to use our reasoning to see what we understand by it. So there was a puzzle and there was an answer, if we can hear it. And what we're going to do really this afternoon is that same thing that we've just done. Look at some puzzling facts about the world and life, mysteries which need explaining. Multiple explanations are put forward. But we are saying that the God explanation is the best one. And we like a good puzzle, don't we? I'm sure if you were following what I was saying and hadn't fallen asleep, you probably did enjoy hearing about those layers of the retina and why is it that our eyes seem to be pointing backwards. And you, I hope, enjoyed the rich explanation that was given. And this is how we're programmed, isn't it, as human beings? Puzzles, we like puzzles, and we like to think about what the solution to them is. So here's another one for you. The human cell. We're just going to reflect on some puzzling facts about the world and weigh up the competing explanations. Where did the cell come from? So that's the puzzle. What is the answer? Evolution is put forward as an effort to explain the presence of life on the planet. But of course, evolution does not explain the presence of life on the planet. Darwin knew that. Evolution attempts to explain the assumed transition from one form of life to another as natural selection acts on random mutation over vast periods of time. That's what it attempts to do. But that is very different from accounting for the origin of life itself. Just consider the cell. The cell, we know, is a kind of supercomputer. It's of a level of extreme complexity. And you can go on YouTube and see computer models attempting to come close to illustrating the activity that goes on inside a cell, and it's staggering. Richard Dawkins said it is a kind of digital computer. And the more we learn about it, the more layers of complexity we find, and we see that the explanation of how it works exactly recedes from us the more we learn. So it's staggeringly complex. Now, the cell can't have evolved because evolution presupposes the existence of the cell. Evolution requires the presence of a cell which already has the capacity to reproduce itself. So evolution works in the theory of it if there is a cell that can reproduce and mutate randomly. But where did the cell come from originally? That's the question. And that is a question that science has no answer for. The idea, which still rattles around in thoughts, the idea that random molecules in a warm pond through a bolt of lightning could have assembled a cell would be the same as saying that a bolt of lightning in a warm pond could assemble a car or a skyscraper. It's preposterous. And Richard Dawkins knew it was preposterous. And therefore, when he was asked, how did we get life originally? He said, maybe aliens brought it from another planet. Now, that's ridiculous, but in a way, it was the best explanation he could come up with without invoking an intelligent creator of the cell in the first place. So there it is, the mystery of the cell. Where did it come from? God tells us where it came from, and we have to make up our minds about the answer to that question. So from the very small to the very large, we ask another question. Why is there a universe? Now, you might say that question has never occurred to me before. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there a universe? Well, up until the 20th century, the prevailing viewpoint among both philosophers and scientists was that the universe is eternal, that it's always been here, that matter and energy have always existed, and the universe never began to exist. Therefore, it seemed there was no need for a creator of the universe. There was no question about why is there a universe. Well, that worldview that the universe is eternal crumbled under the impact of Einstein's general theory of relativity and the application of that theory to cosmology. Einstein said that the universe cannot be static and it cannot be eternal. It can't be a timeless entity. It must be either expanding or collapsing. And his theory predicted that the universe, even time and even space themselves, must have had a beginning at some point in the finite past. And at that point, it was just a theory. But then during the 1920s, observational astronomy began to uncover evidence that what Einstein predicted was right. When Edwin Hubble looked out into the universe and saw that all our neighboring galaxies were moving away from us, were receding from us, and that the further away they were, the faster they were receding, he proved that everything in the universe is flying apart. And reversing the arrow of time, that would predict that at some point, all of these galaxies that are moving away from one another, if you reverse the arrow of time, there must have been a time when they were all together, as it were, in the same place, that there was a beginning point for all of this. And so the purely theoretical predictions that Einstein made are today the prevailing view among contemporary cosmologists, that the universe is in fact finite, that it came into being at a finite time ago, it had a beginning at some point in the past. Now, what does that mean? I mean, we know, don't we, that God said there was a beginning of the universe. So that's one point. But if the universe had a beginning, then it means it must have had a cause, right? Because no event occurs without a cause. So what caused the universe to come into being? Now, I hope I've got some much cleverer people than me to quote here. David Hume, a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, said that there is no event that occurs without a cause. All material objects that have a beginning have a cause. Now, the universe is a material object. It must have had a cause. Now, what caused it? Paul Davies, an English physicist, said the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previously incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. So what caused the universe? The cause must be as well not part of the universe, because it can't cause itself. So whatever caused it to exist must be outside of space and time, not physical and not material. Now, this puts the atheist in a very awkward position. The atheist must hold that the universe came from nothing and by nothing. But surely that doesn't make sense, because out of nothing, nothing comes, isn't it? So why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. And you might say at this point, well, we're beyond what we can know now, aren't we? We're in the realms of science fiction. How are we to know what could have caused the universe? But we can reason a little bit about that question, because whatever caused it must be something outside of it. It must be something that isn't physical and isn't material. Now, we do know about things that exist like that. Something that exists, that we know to exist, which isn't physical or material, are abstract objects, such as numbers, like the number 3. The number 3 exists, but it's not material, it's not physical, but it exists. And so it's an abstract object. So it could be that an abstract object caused the universe. But the other thing that we know exists that isn't physical or material is the mind, about which we know very little, a personal mind. We still can't explain consciousness. Science can't explain it. But we do know that we have a mind, and the mind isn't really a physical or material thing. And when we look at those two options there, what caused the universe in the first place, it could hardly have been an abstract object. They don't cause anything, do they? Whereas a transcendent, intelligent mind could very well fit the bill. So the cosmological argument, as it's called, gives us a personal creator of the universe. So that, for me as well, is a reason. The fact that there is a universe, the fact that it had a beginning, the fact that it must have been caused, means that it makes sense to me to believe that God exists, because what is the alternative answer to that puzzle? Well, is that the only thing about the universe that might point us towards the existence of God? And you might say at this point, well, I can't really grasp those things very well that you've just been talking about. I need a lot of time to think about them, and that would be absolutely understandable. So I'm going to come now to something that we can all understand perfectly well, and something for which we have our own evidence of its existence. And that is the moral question. But before we do that, just to summarize what we've said, God said, I have made the earth and created man upon it. Even my hands have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded. Stretched out, just as we see. It is God that sits upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreads them out as a tent to dwell in. And there is the circle of the earth that we can now see from space. He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. And that's an amazing description, isn't it, of what we see there on the right. There is the earth hung, as it were, upon nothing, as the Bible said it is. But now we come to that element to this argument which we can all readily grasp. There's an enormous literature on this, the reality of morality, of good and bad as perceived by us. And I'm going to give the most understandable version of it. Essentially, there are laws that govern our behavior. We might not think it sometimes when we read the news and sometimes when we observe ourselves in life, but there are laws which govern our behavior. There are two types of laws that govern our behavior. There are political laws. These are legal laws. They are made by nation states. And this first type of law, political laws, the government enacts them with legislation, and it makes certain things forbidden and certain things required. So, for example, the theft of property is forbidden. Council tax must be paid. When a company is recruiting an employee, discriminating against people on the basis of their age or gender is illegal. Right, so these are laws that we all know about and which the government has enacted. They impinge upon us and they govern our behavior. But they aren't the only laws that govern our behavior, because there are also moral laws, another kind of law. There are laws which we feel to be true, that they haven't been enacted by the government. They are simply there inside of us. Like, for example, if we promise to do something, then we ought to keep our promises. Like, for example, we ought to tell the truth. Like, for example, we ought to share and be kind to those in need. The government hasn't enacted laws about that. You know, no one's going to go to prison for those things if they break them. But they exist as laws that govern our behavior, don't they? Now, where did these laws come from? The first kind of laws are enacted by legislatures or monarchs who have the authority to pass such laws and enforce them. We understand those first kind of laws all too well. That explains how they came into being. That explains their origin. But they aren't the only laws that govern our conduct. How do we explain where those moral laws come from? Because many people believe that there are also these moral laws that bind individuals in the same way that political laws do. And as we've said, I am obliged by moral principle not to lie to others. And similarly, I'm obligated to keep my promises. Now, why? Why should I do that? You know, the government is not enacting laws that say you must tell the truth to your friends. You must keep your promises. You ought to be kind and not cruel. There are no political laws about that. And I'm talking about the interpersonal sphere here, aren't I? I'm talking about, and I always visualize it in terms of the time when I was back in primary school. If I promised my friend that I would meet him at the end of the school day at the flagpole and that we'd walk home together, and then I didn't keep that promise, then I would have broken a moral law. I would have felt bad about it. My friend definitely would have felt bad about it. Our wider peer group might censure me for my reckless breaking of promises, you know. And likewise, when you're in school, if you say, well, my uncle's a millionaire, That's something we used to say sometimes in primary school. My uncle's a millionaire, you know, and which, of course, in most cases wasn't true. And so, you know, you felt a bit bad, really, about saying something that wasn't true. But why? Why would you feel bad about lying like that? You know, the government's not stopping children telling lies to the people in their class, is it? So why would we feel bad about it? Where does that law, that moral impulse come from? Now, sometimes political laws coincide with moral principles, like laws against exploitation and laws against murder. You know, that's when the moral and the political are united. But like we said, there is no law saying that if you promised your friend you'd meet them at the end of the day and walk home with them, and that you ought to keep that promise. There's no law about that. Or that you can't tell him you have an uncle who owns a yacht and is a millionaire. You know, you don't, there's no national law against doing those things. So where do they come from, those laws inside us? Well, let's use the reasoning in front of us. The political laws were given by a lawgiver. So it seems plausible that the moral laws must be grounded in some appropriate authority as well, that perhaps someone gave those laws as well. And the only plausible candidate to fulfill that role is God. These laws must also have a lawgiver, and who else could it be? So just again, recruiting some clever minds, Charles Evans, an American philosopher, if one supposes that there is a God and that God wants humans to know him and relate to him, one would expect God to make his reality known to humans in very obvious ways. And the moral law might be exactly one of those things. And in fact, it might be that before I even started speaking this afternoon, you might have felt inside, well, I don't need any of these arguments or reasonings. You know, I know that God exists. I feel it to be true. And it might well be that it's this moral principle inside us that brings us to that point. If an awareness of moral obligations is in fact an awareness of God's divine laws, then anyone who is aware of moral obligations does have a kind of awareness of God. Perhaps someone who has an experience of God in this way does not need a moral argument or any kind of argument to have a reasonable belief in God. So, if these moral laws do exist, then they should have a certain character, shouldn't they? They should have a special kind of force. We should care about complying with them, and violating it should bring blame and guilt. And that is exactly the nature of these kinds of things, isn't it? Because if I was a maths teacher, and I'm not, I don't have to teach maths, but if I did have to, and I was up on the whiteboard doing a maths equation and I made a mistake and broke the maths law, then I would feel silly, sure, but I wouldn't feel guilt and I wouldn't feel shame. But when we break the moral law, I do feel guilty and I do feel shame if I put myself in front of others, if I'm greedy and avaricious, if I entertain immoral thoughts. Guilt and shame are brought to bear inside of us, aren't they? Against which there is no political law for us to be censured by. And on the positive side, there is a universal recognition of things for which there is no law to keep either, such as self-sacrifice, such as courage, such as love, such as equality. There's no political law that you have to keep those things, and yet they're universally praised, aren't they? We all marveled, didn't we, when a few years ago that man from Mali, do you remember, he scaled that building in Paris, 4 stories high, to rescue the 4-year-old boy who was dangling from the balcony. Do you remember that? I mean, I'm sure you must all have seen it. The YouTube video has had 20 million views. And that man from Mali just climbed up the front of the building, didn't he? And he caught the little boy and put him back onto the balcony and saved him. Why did he do that? He risked his own life to do that. If you watch the video, he could have slipped or missed a jump and a grab at any point, and he would have fallen to his death or to his great harm. And he did that for a little boy never ever seen before and wasn't related to. Why did he do that? And why is that so universally praised? Why did the president of France meet that man from Mali and give him the documentation he needed to live legally in France because he was an immigrant? Why? because there is this moral law inside us, which means that we universally praise morally good and selfless deeds. And God's existence provides the best explanation of moral obligations, because how else do we account for them? Now, I'm just going to show you now some evolutionary explanations for morality. So the atheist can fall back on some things here, and this is what they would fall back on. First of all, genetic kinship. Now, this basically says that when a mother sacrifices her safety to save her children, she does that because they have the same genes. And so what seems like an altruistic and noble deed is actually a cunning strategy on the part of the genes of mum to make sure her genes make it to the next generation. And the other explanation is that they are reciprocal advantage. So you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. A businessman might be nice to a customer, not because he is kind and wants to be nice, but he's hoping for a return trade. So reciprocal advantage. Now let's just think about three facts in the world around. Think about great deeds of heroism like the man from Mali did. Just three simple things, like getting up, you're sitting on a bus, getting up and giving your seat to an old lady who comes onto the bus, like donating blood, like volunteering your time or your money when there is a need, such as a famine or an earthquake somewhere else. There you go. There's three morally praiseworthy realities of life that we see around us. You're on a bus, an old lady comes in, you get up and give her your seat. You donate blood. You volunteer time and money for people in another country who have had a disaster. Now, can either of these two explanations here on the screen, evolutionary explanations for those things, can they account for those things? Can they explain them? And of course, they don't explain any of those three examples at all. If you're on a bus and an old lady hobbles in, she's not a relative of yours, so genetic kinship doesn't come into it. And it's hardly reciprocal advantage, is it? You don't get up and give her your seat because you're hoping that next week you're going to get on the bus and it's already full and she'll stand up and give you yours. You're not expecting that, are you? So why do you do it? Evolution can't explain that deed. Neither can it explain why you would give blood, why you would help strangers in a faraway country who you're not related to and who can never repay you, why you would do it. And those are the simple moral facts of the world. And what is the evolutionary explanation for them? There is none. And what we're saying is that the God explanation does a lot better. God's existence provides the best explanation of moral obligations. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. That's recognized by atheists as well, that there is no actual morality. Many theists and atheists alike agree on this point. The position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist of the last century who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. And yet there is meaning and value in life. So how do you account for it? So this is how this reasoning goes, this final one I've been talking about morality. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Atheists and theists are agreed on that. But objective values do exist. And I think we demonstrated that. Therefore, God must exist. And that's why I think this final argument, the moral argument, is the most powerful one for the existence of God. Moral obligations provide strong evidence for God's reality. The Lord Jesus said, "Yea, and why even of yourselves judge ye not what is right?" That we have an innate awareness of what is right. The Apostle Paul writing to the Romans, "For when the Gentiles who have not the law of God do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing them witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. That's the Bible talking about the moral law inside us. So when we reflect then on all these things, when we think about them, we come, I think, to a position where it's very reasonable to say that it makes sense to believe that God exists. Why do we have a cell that shows a structure of complexity? Because the cell has been intelligently designed by an intelligent designer. Why does the universe show complexity and rationality? Well, those are the characteristics of the Creator who made it that way. Why is there morality in the world? Why do we all feel, even when it works against our advantage, a moral law within us? Well, that's because there is a moral lawgiver who gave it to us. How do we account for all the unique features we see in the Bible? Its astonishing survival, transmission, unity, and accuracy of preservation, the fulfilled prophecies and internal consistency, its explanatory power. How do we account for that? Because it is the book from God. And so when we put it all together, the existence of God, all of these mysteries, suddenly the light comes on. It provides an explanation that is better than an atheist explanation. So in conclusion, then, we've seen this afternoon good reasons to think that God exists. Together, these reasons constitute a powerful cumulative case for the existence of God. And if someone wants to jettison that and embrace atheism instead, then he must first tear down all of these reasons that we've gone through and in their place erect a case of their own to prove that God does not exist. And unless and until he does that, I think we can conclude that believing in God is the more plausible worldview. Faith is a position that makes sense, and it is a position full of hope and the prospect of joy and peace. Thank you for your kind attention this afternoon.